train tracks ran along this path here. They came off the main sidings of the Malkinia sidings, and they came on this path that we have over here, straight into the camp that we're going to get to in a second. It turned off to the left, okay, there. She ran that way and then up. We'll be passing it in a second. The train journey itself, of course, was very traumatic. Trains that were meant to be according to the, at least according to the agreement, or I should say the authorities have said that trains itself could have 60 soldiers on it maximum. Had an average of 120 people, Jewish people on the trains, on the cattle cars. Now we know, as we said already to a couple of people that are here, the longest train journey that we have to the area of Auschwitz at least, and one of the longest train journeys that we know of as well, is close to 13 days. Now you put a person on a train for 13 days and he has no food and no water, he's going to die. And I mentioned as well to a couple of people that were here yesterday as well, another story of course of Jan Karski. Karski writes when he sees trains, the trains themselves are sometimes sprayed with chlorine to affect the eyes of people. And like the trains that were coming to Treblinka, many of them had lime coated on the bottom of them. And the lime, when water hits the lime, it starts to bubble. It's like cement. When you see cement starting to be made, it's this bubbling that you see. Karski describes the idea that the lime itself would literally burn the flesh, and people would be burnt inside those carriages. The trains that came from Warsaw were filled up. Numbers again range from 100 always upwards. Over 230 is the highest number that we have of people that arrive on a train carriage. And the reason is very simple. People from the roof of the train carriage, from the heads to the roof of the train carriage, there was room. And they threw in babies and they threw in kids to fill up the room. Because why should you send a half-empty carriage? If you can send 230 in a carriage, why should I only send 120 in the carriage? Now once again, even though this is a death camp, we have survivors, because there was on August the 2nd a rebellion of 1943. And so they were able to tell us some things. This is a testimony. But the miracle did not happen. And with a few moments, we definitely knew that the train had changed its direction, and we were now travelling eastwards. It was as though there was an explosion in the carriage. People shrieked to the high heavens. The little children in the carriage could not understand what it all meant, but they all began to cry at the tops of their voices. I looked at my own family members, and it seemed to me as though they had all grown old. My little sister Malkala, who was 9 years old, understood what it all meant. She was weeping bitterly. "Mummy, I've never done any harm to anybody." My sister Rochala was 12 years old. She clung to me and said, "Aaron, I'm terribly afraid. Look after me." She held on to me with all her might. My sister Bracha, who was pregnant, wept in a loud voice. She was 28. "But my baby hasn't even been born yet, never sinned. Why is he doomed?" Her husband stood stroking her hair, looking at them. I could no longer restrain myself, and I also began weeping. But I did my best to weep silently, so that my voice should not be heard. It was now plain that we were to be taken to Treblinka. I looked around at the people. There were images of dread and horror. Some tore their hairs, some flung themselves about in despair, some cursed with all their strength. A woman clutched her baby to her breast with all her force. The child began to make strangling noises, while the women whispered loving words to it and pressed it to her heart all the more. "Look what she's doing! Look what she's doing! She's gone mad!" came the cries from all sides. "It's my child, it's mine! I want him to die a holy death. Let him die a holy death." And by the time people succeeded in getting the child away, he was choked. One Jew near us went mad. Round his neck was a white scarf. He took it off and he tied it to one of the iron hooks in the carriage wall in order to hang himself. People tried to stop him. He punched, he kicked with tremendous force and cried, "Let me hang myself!" They succeeded in dragging the scarf out of his hands and then he collapsed in the corner. At the end of August 1942, the Germans carried out expulsions from all over Poland. One of them came from the town of Mazarich. When the Jews were brought to the railway car, the Germans forced 150 to 200 of them onto the freight cars that were designed for 60 or 70. The cars were closed with no boards, with boards. Water and food were not provided. People were suffering. There was no air to breathe. Before we moved off, the Germans sprinkled chlorine into the cars. It burned the eyes of the people. The weaker among us fainted. People climbed on top of each other and banged on the walls with whatever they could find. The children were so thirsty in the summer they licked their mother's sweat. There were 150 people in our freight car. During the 2-day trip to Treblinka, 135 suffocated. He didn't even have to arrive here. He died on the way. As the trains arrived to Treblinka, those famous scenes that you have seen on Schindler's List happened here as well. To the Markinia sidings, Avram Bomber described what he saw outside the window. He said, then very slowly the train turned off for the main track and rolled at a walking pace through a wood. While he looked out, we'd been able to see a window, and an old man in our compartment saw a boy where he was with the cows that were grazing. And he asked the boy in signs, where are we going? And the boy said, trains arrived through this area over here, the sleepy forest. It's a forest which is very similar to the forest of Gamno. It's a forest which is very similar to the forest of Sobibor. And they arrived to a completely different world. And the truth is that the man who will become the commandant of Treblinka wants them to think they're in a different world. They've travelled over borders. And they arrived towards the main gates of Treblinka. Careful.